In this video, I'm going to show you how to make the two color charts that you'll make for your own exercises. We'll be making a glazing color chart and then a color chart in which you mix all of the colors. I recommend your squares for your charts are at least an inch tall and an inch wide. I'm just using the width of my ruler to lay in the vertical columns in my grid, and I'll use it likewise to make the rows. You'll be mixing with the 7 colors that we talked about in my previous video. So you'll use your lemon yellow, yellow ochre, alizarin crimson, cadmium scarlet, ultramarine blue, Prussian blue, and burnt umber. And I recommend keeping them in the same order going across your 2 different rows, and also keeping them in the same order for your columns. So you can see I'm writing them all in so that I know what I'm mixing with what in each square. Also, for your color mixing chart, you will put a diagonal line across to separate into 2 triangles. The top triangle you will lay in color at full saturation, and the bottom triangle you'll lay in color at kind of a half saturation, so a tint of that same color. I recommend working on both charts simultaneously just for efficiency. Watercolor bleeds when it touches other watercolor that's wet, and so if you want sharp edges, you'll have to let your edges dry before painting an adjacent color. So for your glazing chart, you'll start with every other color in columns, and then later you can lay in the rows once that's all dry. So here I'm laying in the lemon yellow with my wider square brush. That's a good use for that brush. It should fit nicely into your chart and allow you to kind of pull an even color down through those columns. So glazing is layering one color over another color once that first color has dried. And you'll notice ultimately that it has a very different quality to it. So let's say you're mixing lemon yellow and ultramarine blue together in the color mixing chart. You would just mix those 2 colors in your palette and then lay them onto the paper. But in a glazing scenario, you would lay, say, the lemon yellow down and let that dry, and then lay the ultramarine blue over it. And that will create kind of a different, more luminous green, and it won't be as green as if you mixed it together in the color mixing scenario. Also, kind of keep in mind, so down the center of your color mixing grid, that diagonal line, you have the square where lemon yellow meets lemon yellow and yellow ochre meets yellow ochre. So those will just be the pure colors. On the upper part of the square, you'll have the full saturation, and on the lower part, you'll have the less saturated. Because those are touching, you'll only be able to lay in 1/2 of the square at a time. And since I already have colors mixed up that I was painting in the glazing chart, I'm going over and applying those as well in my color mixing chart. And just a reminder, again, I did not paint anything in between the lemon yellow and the cadmium, for example, or the cadmium and the ultramarine on the glazing chart, because those colors need to dry before I can go back in and lay in the other columns. So the color mixing chart is going to take the longest of these exercises. You'll be referring to the color listed in the column and the color listed in the row, and those are the 2 colors you'll be mixing together. and you will mix them in more or less equal proportion, although I would give some consideration to the fact that some colors are more potent than others. So for instance, the Prussian blue will overpower the yellows, and so you might use slightly less blue to yellow in the ratio to kind of get a similar impact of each color on the other and find that middle ground. And when you find you've kind of made the color in your palette that is a 50-50 mix of the two colors, then you can lay them into the appropriate square. And meanwhile, you can then dilute that color that you've just mixed and put it in the square in the lower corner of your chart. And that will be efficient time-wise. Okay, so I am just mixing up the combination of ultramarine blue with burnt umber. It makes this muddy color here. I'm painting it in with a full saturation. And then I'm dipping my brush in water and going straight to the other square. And that will probably give me about the right amount of water to dilute that color. If you need a little bit more, you can dip back into the color you just made and it'll spread out in the square. Because of water tension and the way water kind of loves itself, if you already have a wet area on the paper and then you dab a little bit more pigment into it, it should kind of spread out pretty well throughout an area. Sometimes it needs a little help. Like if the paper is warped, it might pool in the lower part of the warpage. Also, if you have too much liquid in an area and you need to blot some of it out, remember that you can take your brush to your fabric or paper towel and soak all of the water out of it so that your brush is thirsty. Then you can go back to your paper and blot some of that moisture up, and that can also help you control value. So I'm choosing to paint every other square because, again, I don't want my colors to touch because they'll bleed into each other. So by now, the glazing colors that I've already painted in have dried, and so I'm going to take the opportunity to go back over and fill in the gaps between the ones I already painted. And you don't have to be perfect here in terms of getting them right up against each other, but do try to get a wide enough space that you'll be able to really see what the colors look like laid on top of one another. And once I get this Prussian blue laid in, I'm going to have to wait for those colors I've just painted in to dry completely before I can put in the rose. While I wait for that glazing chart to dry, I'm returning to the color mixing chart and just chipping away at putting in more of the squares. So with this alizarin, I didn't wait long enough for those to dry, and so the more saturated color has bled into my less saturated side. And so I'm using my thirsty brush to try to kind of corral that paint, but you can see that it's still bled in, and it's not something that I can fix perfectly without going back into it later perhaps, but I'm just going to leave it. And if that happens to you here or there throughout your chart, that's okay, but you really do want to keep in mind with watercolor what is wet and what is dry when you're painting. This has switched into stop motion speed of me filling in these squares, keeping them kind of checkerboard distance from each other and watching the corners. And then I'm going to go back in and do the rows for the glazing chart. So each of these columns is completely dry, and now I'm working again with my wide square brush to mix a nice saturated version of the color in the row, and now I'm laying from the yellow toward the blue, just nice even light pressure, the lemon yellow over all of those colors. And now I could just go down the row and do each of the colors as long as I left a little gap between them. But if I think that they're going to touch, then I wouldn't want to do that. So I'm just kind of hopping around a little bit here. But now I'm back to the yellow ochre, which is the next in my row. And again, mixing a pure yellow ochre and laying it all the way across the row. A little more pigment there. Now I'm cleaning out my palette. You can see I don't have a spot where I can make a pure color, so I've just gotten it kind of wet, and then I have gone in and mixed some fresh alizarin crimson, it looks like, and so I'm going to skip down a notch there and let that yellow ochre dry before I go back to it. Now I'm going over these a couple of times, but again, I'm being really gentle, and you definitely don't want to scrub, and you're trying not to pick up the color that's already down. So that will definitely happen if your color is wet, but also if you spend too much time working the area, it can start to kind of pick up that pigment again. So try to avoid that. So once I have gone in here with the Prussian blue, I'm going to let that glazing chart dry again before I go back and fill in the cadmium, the ultramarine, and the burnt umber, and then that will complete the glazing chart. I'm mixing the rest of my little squares here in the color mixing chart. I do make an error in a moment, and you'll see that I blotted up here in the ultramarine column. And because I'm making a color similar to what I put down there, I was able to blot it up and then let that dry and then come back in with the color that was supposed to be there. If that happens to you, you can always just paste a little piece into there to kind of save your chart. So this is the end of my color chart demonstration. The next video will show color matching, so head on to that when you're ready.